Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Aspen Security Forum and the Aspen Strategy Group. I'm Nick Burns, the Executive Director, and we're really pleased to host the President of Colombia, Iván Duque Márquez, this morning. He'll be interviewed by my friend Gideon Rachman, the Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator of the Financial Times in London. As all of you know, Colombia is a great friend of the United States and one of the most important countries in the Western Hemisphere. Many of us in successive US administrations, myself included, had the privilege of working on Plan Colombia, which was a generational commitment by the United States to help the Colombian people at a very difficult moment. Now the Colombian people are facing, how can they continue to implement the peace agreement that was reached with the FARC movement in 2016? Can they continue to face this great humanitarian crisis that has spilled over their border from Venezuela, more than 1.8 million Venezuelan refugees now in Colombia? President Duque is also dealing with the horrible COVID-19 crisis. He has called it one of the great challenges for the people of Colombia, in fact, for the people of the world. And he has had to suffer, as have the people of Colombia, from the tragic death of Defense Minister Carlos Holmes Trujillo. As we look ahead, Colombia and the United States hopefully will continue the very good relationship they've had. I would say, Mr. President, that one of the good fortunes we have right now is that our new president, Joe Biden, was intensely involved in the Western Hemisphere and in South America when he was vice president of the United States. He's someone who knows the region well, and I sincerely hope that we'll see a continuation of this very positive relationship between Colombia and the United States. So it's a great pleasure to welcome the President of Colombia and Gideon Rachman. Gideon, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks, Ambassador Burns. It's a privilege for me to be able to do this from London, all by the miracle of Zoom. President Duque, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us. There's so many things to ask you. Nick's outlined several of them, but I guess the thing that's on everybody's mind at the moment is COVID. From what I read, that Colombia started quite well, but like everybody, you're suffering from a second wave. Could you give us a sense of where you think you are with the pandemic?
Well, thank you so much, Gideon. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I also want to express my gratitude to Professor Burns and to all the people that are joining us today. Well, let me begin, Gideon, by saying that I consider that this pandemic is the most complicated crisis the world has faced since World War II. And we have seen more than 100 million people infected over the world, and we have seen more than 2.2 million people that have passed away, that have died because of the effects of this virus. When we look at a country like Colombia, a middle-income country, and we evaluate how we have been doing throughout the whole pandemic, I think there are two very important messages. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a group of people who tried to say that there was a dilemma between protecting health and life and protecting economic and social development. Since the very beginning, we said, well, there's no dilemma. We need them both. And we have to face this crisis attending both. Because without good health, you won't have social and economic development. And without social and economic development, you would not improve continuously the healthcare system. Now, what have we done and where we are now, right now? We have been able to duplicate the amount of ICUs in Colombia. We began with maybe 5,400, and now we are above 11,300. That has been a major jump, and today Colombia is the leader in terms of ICUs per 100,000 inhabitants. That's important, and that allows us to be able to deal with the waves without having to suffer from a scarcity of ICUs. So that's something positive. Now, on the other hand, when we look at two indicators, deaths per million and contagions per million, we look in a much better shape than developed countries and other countries in Latin America. And even in our lethality rate is around 2.5%, which is similar to some developed countries and to other countries in Latin America, but obviously it's also in a much better shape than other countries around the world that have a higher income per capita. And as of today, we're getting close to a 93% recovery rate. That means people that have suffered the illness, 93% of them have been recovered. We have 4.7% inactive cases, and we have a lethality rate of 2.5%. So that's where we stand.
What do you see as the... Sorry.
If I may add something quickly, we have been able to recover pre-pandemic unemployment numbers by the end of last year, and we have to keep it that way. So as of today, two very important objectives: massive vaccination and safe recovery. Those are the two elements that we were going to face in 2021.
Yeah, that was the quick follow-up, and it doesn't require a very long answer. But the thing that I was interested in is everybody here in the UK and I think in the US are currently preoccupied by vaccinations and seeing it as the way out. Is that the same approach in Colombia, essentially, that vaccination is the silver bullet, if you like?
Well, I think, Gideon, we have to look this as a bittersweet. And let me begin with the sweet. I think it's a triumph of science that the world has been able to find vaccines in less than 1 year to face this pandemic. There's no precedent of this massive action of science. So that's very important. And I think we all have to praise that. Now, the bitter part is that I consider that the world has not been able to find a coherent multilateral response on how to use science to attend the massive vaccination that is needed in the whole world, that has to reach 70% of all humanity. And by that, I think we have taken the approach of buying vaccines through the multilateral scheme of COVAX, and that's important. Colombia has been selected in the first round of the 18 countries in the world that will receive vaccines from COVAX. And we have also bought vaccines bilaterally. But I am worried, Gideon, when I see statements like the one we saw this morning to restrict the exports of vaccines coming out from Europe, or that at least there has been an increasing amount of restrictions, because I think at this moment, it is a message that is quite confusing. And it has not helped that we have seen countries around the world that have high economic power buying 3 and 4 times their population in vaccines, because that distorts the whole market. And I think we are now at a moment where certainly if there is coordination, I think we can all address the need to have that response. We are going to begin the vaccination program on February the 20th. We expect to vaccinate 35 million Colombians so that we reach 70% of the population in the seek of herd immunity. But that obviously implies that the supplies will be fulfilled according to the schedules. And obviously that unfortunately does not depend on us, but we are now in a level of comfort because we will begin 20th of February, and we expect to have the first line of action in responding in the medical sector and people above 80 in the first round. In the second round, we expect to have people between 70 and 80 and people that are in the second and third line, and then people between 60 and 70 and people with pre-existence. When we have fulfilled that group, I think the consequence is that we will have a significant drop on the lethality rate in Colombia, and that is obviously our first priority.
Thanks. And turning back to the more sort of normal, if you like, political issues, obviously the biggest single challenge any Colombian president is going to face is war and peace, internal peace. You inherited a peace deal that was signed in 2016, but from what I read, that there are some worries about concerns that it's becoming a little fragile. How's it going?
I wouldn't use the word fragile, Gideon. When we look at the evidence, I think they're very important numbers to share and facts to be shared. When we began our administration, we only had 2 regional focused development plans, and there had to be 16. We have accomplished the design of the other 14, and today we have 16. We have obviously gotten into the regions and taking the initiative of building important projects for social and economic development. And now we have surpassed 1,000 projects that have been finished in our administration. Most of the people that are in the process of reinsertion, that were former combatants, that were former members of FARC, they have now access to Social Security, to financing, and we're actually starting a program of titling so that they can connect becoming owners of their property linked with productive projects. In terms of land titling, we have become the government that has provided more land titles in the recent history of Colombia. And all those are very important accomplishments. And the same closing the gaps in the rural areas. Obviously, we face still a lot of threats because there were dissidencies of FARC that have been killing social leaders, attempting to the lives of people that are in the reinsertion program that have not been tempted by their influence. But I also believe that there are two very contundent results that we achieved in 2020. The lowest homicide rate in 46 years, Gideon. The lowest homicide rate and the lowest kidnapping rate in more than 3 decades. That is a demonstration that our policy of peace with legality is evolving and is evolving at a good pace. We have asked the United Nations to remain as an observer and guarantor that monitors independently all the achievements that we have set as goals. But obviously, I have to mention that there are very important two challenges to mention. One is the transitional justice. Will the transitional justice be able to punish proportionally, according to international law, crimes against humanity, or are they going to leave those crimes in impunity? That's a challenge. If impunity is the one who wins out of the transitional justice process, definitely that will have a negative impact on people's trust. But I don't want to make a judgment. I'm just expecting that they will be able to create, to be able to have clear sentences of punishment. And the other great challenge is how do we keep on dismantling all the dissidencies that have tried to go back to narco trafficking, and we have been fighting them severely, but we have also been gotten to those areas of former influence of FARC with social investment, and we expect this year to surpass $500 million in investment in those areas. So in a nutshell, I think it's also bittersweet, more sweet than bitter, but we have to face these challenges with focus and looking at as a state policy for the following years.
Just a brief follow-up. I mean, you talk about sort of dissident FARC. I mean, how organized is this? Is this really a formidable group, or is it just quite splinters that you're talking about? How big is the challenge?
Well, the challenge in terms of armed people is not that big, but there is a logistical and operational challenge, and is that most of the kingpins of the dissidencies have been protected and have received harbor in Venezuela by the Maduro regime. When you look at Iván Márquez, Jesus Santrich, El Paisa, Romaña, guys who are very recognized terrorists, they are protected in Venezuela. They have linkages to the close inner circle of Maduro. And the same happens with kingpins from ELN like Pablito or Antonio Garcia. So we have been denouncing that internationally, multilaterally, and we will keep on doing so. And we have been attacking and defeating the structures in different parts of the country. They're not that big, but obviously they have a capacity to hide and move very fast in the border zones. But we have demonstrated that with the intelligence, that with the capacity, we have been able to knock most of their capacities in Colombia, and we have to eradicate those groups. And the way to eradicate is not only by putting all the military pressure, but also we have seen that by the pressure, many of those militants have dropped out and have decided to enter into a legality route where they know they have to face a sentence. But that pressure has to remain. And that pressure is not just a decision of my administration. This should be a state policy because those groups are linked to narco trafficking. And that's why we have also decided to be very focused on eliminating the first source of money. Last year, Gideon, and I finish with this, we had the highest level of interdiction. We were able to seize more than 500 tons of cocaine. That's the highest number ever reached by Colombia. And we were able to eradicate manually 130,000 hectares. That has allowed us to affect their economic apparatus, and we will continue to do so.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Venezuela and your belief that these people are being supported, gaining kind of shelter there. So, which brings us to the question of what should policy be to Venezuela? I think some of the hopes that were around that President Maduro might be on his way out seem to be diminishing. And I saw that last week, for example, the European Union has stopped recognizing Juan Guaido as president and said now he's just a valued interlocutor. So I wondered, how do you think that the world should be treating the Maduro regime? And for example, that EU initiative, is it a wrong step, a right step? What do you think?
Well, the first thing to say, Gideon, is that we all have to be blunt and sincere. The European Union and many countries around the world in times of crisis have united in terms of denouncing and calling things by the name. Nicolas Maduro is a Latin American equivalent of Slobodan Milosevic. He's a criminal against humanity. All the facts on his attitudes and the way he has affected the people, it's simply insane. And he has triggered the most important migration crisis ever seen in Latin America. Now, could we just remain watching him in power and not doing anything? Obviously not. And I think the diplomatic seizure or diplomatic blockade that has been configured by multilateral statements from the Lima Group, from the Contra Group, from the OUN, from the OAS, I think they have made an impact. Because 2 years ago, Maduro was recognized as the president of Venezuela, and he no longer is. We are not recognizing him. Many countries in Latin America, the United States has not recognized him. The European Union does not recognize him. And I think that has been a major step of diplomacy. Now, when you look at who represents Venezuela, the OAS is not Maduro's people. It is the assembly. When you look at the IDB, the same. Now, the four things that have to be met in the case of Venezuela is obviously that Maduro steps out, that there is a transitionary government with broad participation, there is a genuine call for free elections, and that there is a plan for economic and social recovery. Obviously, it all depends on how the dictatorship ends. And I think the big call that has to be made is, how is it that we're going to reach that objective? When I look at things that have been done in the past, and that's why I mentioned Milosevic, and that's why I also mention sometimes Gaddafi and other criminals of that nature, the world has been able to unite and say, this is it, no more. And I think today, the most important thing, and that's why also I believe there's hope with the Biden administration, is because in the United States, this has been bicameral, bipartisan. And if there is a call for all us to unite so that the dictatorship comes to an end, well, I think that's what we all have to do. But let me say something very blunt. We have received in Colombia 2 million migrants. We are taking the biggest financial and fiscal burden out of this. We have seen a lot of pledges from the international community, and we value that and we thank for that. But when you look in comparison, the migration crisis in Syria vis-a-vis the migration crisis in Venezuela, the amount per migrant in the Syrian crisis from the whole world is something close to $2,000. When you look at what has been the case with Venezuela, it doesn't get up to $200. So this cannot remain as it is, because it will become more negative, and the impact of this is going to hurt day by day Latin America. This has to come to an end.
Yeah, I mean, you've been noted for taking a pretty welcoming and liberal approach to refugees, but as you suggest, absorbing that number of people can be destabilizing. It can cause divisions, controversy. I mean, how are you coping with the refugee influx, and are you concerned that it may become more of a political issue in Colombia or destabilize your society?
Gideon, I decided to take an approach since the very beginning of my administration saying that our migration policy was going to be based on one word: fraternity. We have Venezuelans, brothers and sisters, who have left Venezuela with frozen bones, with hunger, without a medical attention. And we have tried to be able to support that in Colombia. Obviously, I have to thank, yes, we have received support from the international community. It would be unthankful from my side if I don't recognize that. But have those numbers been enough to deal with such a crisis? Obviously not. It represents almost 4% of our population that has come to our territory in less than 3 years. And the same thing in proportion is happening in Ecuador, in Peru, in Chile. So this has to come to an end, not because we consider that the Venezuelans and brothers and sisters are a problem. No, it's because the massive migration is a threat in terms of not being able to attend, to employ, to guarantee their rights. So that's why the crisis is so big. But we have been able to, with fraternity, do very relevant state policies. We have guaranteed the nationality for kids that didn't have a registry in Venezuela, and that were going to be, throughout the world without that recognition. We gave them that. We have been able to formalize almost 800,000 Venezuelans in Colombia so that they have a working permit. And we have been able to grant attention. But do we have an unlimited capacity to deal with an unlimited flow? The answer is no. So the solution to this has to be based under the understanding that this is the most complicated and worrisome migration crisis that the world has ever seen in the Western Hemisphere. And the way to put an end to this is putting an end to the dictatorship, calling for the free elections, and setting a plan for economic recovery. And it's the only way out of this. So I just beg that the whole world recognizes that this is a matter that cannot last longer. Every day that passes without a solution becomes a threat to the stability of Latin America.
Thanks. I think you've got that point across very firmly. I've got a couple more questions I want to ask you before turning it over to the audience, but I just wanted to remind the hundreds of people who are watching that they have the ability to send questions through the chat, and I will relay them to President Duque in a few minutes. So if you want to do that, do feel free. The obvious next question, particularly for an American audience, is you've got a change of president in the United States. What do you expect what do you hope for from the Biden administration?
Well, let me also begin by saying that next year in 2022, we will be celebrating 200 years of the bilateral relationship between the United States and Colombia. Next year, we will remember a diplomat like Manuel Torres, who was actively participating with the President Monroe and also with Secretary John Quincy Adams those days, where Colombia was recognized, and Colombia was the first former Spanish colony to be recognized as a state by the United States of America. So that has been 200 years of our strong relationship. Now, in the last 20 years, I consider the bilateral relationship has been strengthening day by day with something that has been very important. It has been a bipartisan, bicameral support. And that I consider it's something that we have to keep and protect every day. With President Clinton, Plan Colombia began. With President Bush, we had the free trade agreement. With President Obama, many of the cooperation apparatus strengthened to support Colombia in many fronts. And obviously, with President Trump, we also had very strong support. So we considered that with President Biden, things have to continue strengthening and improving day by day for also two very important reasons. He has been close to Latin America. He has been close to Colombia. And while he was a senator, he was one of the architects of Plan Colombia. He knows Colombia very well. And I think our agenda is going to be broader in many fronts. I mean, obviously, we will continue working against narco trafficking and terrorism. And obviously, we will keep on working on hemispheric security, the defense of democracy in the region. But I also think there's an agenda in climate change, energy transition, creative industries, and connecting the fourth industrial revolution to be a trigger of job opportunities for the young people. So I believe this agenda is going to be broader, and we will continue to strengthen our relationship with the United States. And I also feel as something important and relevant, the love that President Biden has expressed for Colombia over the years.
But President Biden has, I think, made it clear that, after the last 4 years, his priorities very much are initially domestic rebuilding. I think what President Obama called nation building at home. Are you concerned that any administration is going to kind of lack the bandwidth and the interest to really re-engage with Latin America, given how many problems they have in North America?
I remember Kenichi Omai is saying a very nice phrase when he said, "In nowadays, we have to think globally and act locally." And I think all of us who are now leading countries recognize that we have multiple fronts, but obviously we have a very high pressure from our inner situation, internal situation. Obviously, we're facing more deficits, more debt, unemployment. That's true. And we have to face it. And obviously, in the case of the United States, those challenges were very clearly defined by him in his inaugural address. But at the same time, the way in which he solves internally the challenges that he has before him are going to have important international effects. So, for example, he has set very important goals in terms of climate change. So do we. He went back to the Paris Accord. We're part of the Paris Accord. Colombia has said that we want to reduce by 51% our CO2 emissions by 2030. That's a very big pledge. And we're setting the agenda to get there. So we want to get there also with international support, with the private sector participation on the energy transition and many other fronts. So that also involves the United States. When we think about defending democracy in the hemisphere, it's because it's a must. It's important for him, it's important for us. When we look at the migration crisis in Central America, when we see people mobilizing and trying to reach the United States, we obviously recognize that the best way to prevent that to happen is to have more social and economic development in those countries. And something that I consider as a very important historical precedent is that this year we will be celebrating 60 years since the Alliance for Progress. The Alliance for Progress was designed by President Kennedy as a way to have a strong interaction with Latin America. I consider that today, with all the free trade agreements that we have, with the investment that we have, with small things, with a small decision, and especially thinking on what has been called nearshoring. If there are companies from the United States that are going to nearshore their investments from Asia, looking at being closer to market, and that happens successfully, that is going to generate employment. That is going to bring opportunities, and that for sure is going to become a preventer of migration flow to the United States. Because the reason people want to migrate massively is because they have lost their jobs, they don't have resources, and once they cross the border, they multiply by the exchange rate in their own countries. But if you build the opportunities in Latin America, and you consider that nearshoring is really a right mechanism to generate development and to generate interdependency in a positive way, I think that could be successful and will be connected to the internal objectives that President Biden has set.
Yeah. I mean, one thing you allude to is obviously Asia policy is part of the whole picture. And I think people already anticipate a degree of continuity between the Biden and Trump administrations in adopting a more confrontational approach towards China. And I wonder where you stand on that, because China is an increasingly important investor in Latin America. I know looking in Europe, some people are a little wary of signing up for what they think is an American effort to create a new Cold War with China. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but you know where I'm going. What's your attitude to that? I mean, if America says, okay, we'd like you to take a slightly tougher attitude towards China, what's your view?
Well, Gideon, I have been asked many times, and I remember last year when I was in the World Economic Forum in Davos before the pandemic erupted, I remember I got a question from a journalist and said, okay, are you going to limit Chinese investment in Colombia? And I said, well, in Colombia, we're looking for investors from China, from the US, from France, from elsewhere, from wherever the investment can come, because we cannot segregate, we cannot limit, we cannot discriminate who invests and who doesn't. Obviously, we have our legislation, we have our rule of law, and anyone or any company that wants to invest in Colombia has to invest within our rules. So we cannot discriminate that. And when I have been asked a question on what our relationship with China is, I have said, well, we have had diplomatic relationships for 4 decades. For 4 decades. And obviously, when we look at the trade relationship, our trade balance is negative for Colombia. Why? China produces a lot of goods and services and they export. That's part of their strategy. But if we have a negative trade balance, what we have to do day by day is try to close that deficit. And that only closes by exporting more. And diversifying our exports is also strategical for us. So that's why I visited China in 2019. And I remember that we had an approach saying, okay, this is what Colombia has to offer. And what has been also very important is that we have duplicated our agricultural exports to China. Is that good for Colombia? Yes. The same as it is to expand our exports to the United States or our exports to Europe or our exports even within the Americas, within Latin America. So I don't see this as I don't want to see this as a bipolar world. I want to see this as a multipolar world where countries that are like Colombia, that are middle income countries, we cannot discriminate. We have to be able to connect ourselves with the whole world, obviously, as I have said, with our own rules and protecting our constitution and our legislation.
Okay, quick follow-up on that one from me before I turn it over to questioners elsewhere. But to focus it a bit more, you know, an issue that's been of concern to the United States that we in the UK felt pressure on as well is 5G. You know, if Huawei were to offer the best commercially, the best deal on 5G to Colombia, would you take it?
I think that's a very good question, Gideon, because before we get to 5G, I'm going to tell you another anecdote. Sometimes I've been asked by friends from Congress in the United States or business leaders that say, hey, why is it that China has been growing so fast its investments in Colombia? And I have said, because, you know, we have open biddings and they come and they participate and they win. And obviously, if somebody wants to question why are the Chinese winning those projects and not the United States companies, I have said because the United States companies have not participated in those bids, or other countries have not been participating in those bids. So in the case of infrastructure projects, what we want, it's everybody to come and transparently bid and get the best offer. The Chinese companies won the Bogotá Metro project. They have won 4-generation highways projects, and they are doing something on sewage in the rivers of Colombia. That happens. They are participating, and we just want to be able to call more investors to participate in those bids. So that's one element. And when we talk about 5G, that has become a more controversial issue because people have raised security concerns, not only in Latin America, in the whole world. And I know that that's a big debate nowadays. But what's also important is that we as Colombians have made clear that we will have 70% of the Colombian population with fast-speed internet, 4G networks by next year, and we're going to start the process of expanding the 5G networks. We're doing some pilots, but obviously it will come to a point where we are going to call for bids, and maybe that would not be in my administration, that will be in the next administration. But once that happens, what we have to ensure are 3 elements: transparency, competitiveness, and security. If there are minimum doubts of who can ensure absolute security in terms of the management of information through the network, well, that has to be the ticket to be able to enter the contest. If those three elements are not met, you don't expect people to participate, because at the end, what is happening in the long run is not the network itself, it's the information that moves through the network, and what do you do with that information? So you don't want to have AI being applied with unlawful uses of information. And something that Colombia has been a pioneer in Latin America is that last year we issued the ethical framework for AI. We have now an ethical framework for AI, and we have also passed through Congress a new bill for telecom where security matters, and we will simply not allow people to participate. That does not guarantee the levels of security that are needed to manage that information with the state policy in the mid, long, and term.
Okay, thanks. Now let me turn to the questioners. First question, I'd like to call upon General David Petraeus, who I believe is out there somewhere in the ether, and I'll leave it up to the Atlantic people to connect him to you. So maybe a little
Thanks,
pause.
Gideon. And thanks, Mr. President. It's great to see you. Two quick questions. First, given the worrisome resumption of coca and also cocaine production in recent years, notwithstanding the achievements in the interdiction and eradication programs that you mentioned, is it possible to resume the aerial eradication program, given how effective it was, maybe with small drones or sizable drones, to ensure precision and avoid risk to pilots? And then second, given the fiscal pressures because of Colombia's long-standing discipline in fiscal matters, could Colombia nonetheless relax that discipline for a couple of years and accept additional deficit spending in order to stimulate the economy and to invest in infrastructure that will increase productivity in the future? All of that, obviously, given the pandemic challenges that you've nonetheless seen. And thanks again for doing this as well, Mr. President.
Thank you so much, General. It's a great honor to see you again. And I still remember the conversation we had in June 2018 before I took my oath of office. And you remember that we were at the Concordia Summit, and I showed you a graph that between 2000 and 2014, the coca crops in Colombia dropped from 180,000 hectares to less than 60,000 hectares. And between 2014 and my oath of office, there was an exponential spike from less than 60,000 hectares to more than 200,000 hectares. And I remember that you asked me, how do you plan to, what's your plan to face this situation? And I said, my first plan is to stop the exponential growth. We reached that goal at the end of 2018. My second goal that I also shared with you is that we had to make rapid reductions. And we also undertook that purpose, and we reached it. Actually, in 2019, we had a reduction of more than 9%, based also on UN monitoring criteria. On 2020, we had 130,000 hectares manually eradicated, obviously with a risk of reseeding, which continues to be a very a threat. But we have been dealing with all the protocols that have been requested by the Constitutional Court of Colombia to reestablish the precision aerial spray. I went myself to the court. I made myself before the court, and the court asked for 6 protocols. And we were moving very fast. Last year, because of the pandemic, we had a setback because the previous consultation with communities was not able to be done by judicial order virtually. So we had to wait months. But I expect that by the end of the first trimester of this year, we will have enabled that capacity. But it's not a silver bullet, and it's not just one tool. And I remember that we had the conversation with you, and you draw on a piece of paper your view of the counterinsurgency, also based on your experience in Afghanistan. And we said in that conversation that we have to combine all the tools, which is alternative development, substitution, aerial spray, and at the same time dismantling laboratories. And that's why we have been able to have the highest seizures ever, with the largest rate of laboratories destruction. And at the same time, we're taking social investments to the areas where those crops are. It's not that we just eradicate and leave. We want to eradicate, but we also want to take the social investment from the state. So I think that will be issue number one. The issue number two that you raised, this is kind of complicated for me because we closed 2019, General Petraeus, with the lowest fiscal deficit in almost 6 years. And we closed 2019 with the first fiscal primary surplus since the fiscal rule was established. But then the pandemic came. And obviously, the pandemic hit us with a level of debt to GDP that was close to 50%, which was the level that I inherited. But we knew we had to expand our debt and we will have to expand our deficit to attend the pandemic. And we had a payroll subsidy of 40 and 50% of the minimum wage for almost 12 months to protect employment in Colombia. And we have been able to grant that subsidy to more than 3.4 million people. We also created a non-conditional transfer for families that were not in a conditional transfer program in Colombia that has reached almost 3 more million people. So we have made those bets to protect, and we also launched a credit guarantees of 90% so that we keep on mobilizing credit to SMEs. And yes, we know the deficit is going to grow. We know the debt is going to grow, but we have also said to the markets, and we have said that to the rating agencies, that we are going to go through a social fiscal reform that will have its fiscal effects in 2022, but the social effects have to be spread all over in 2021. And we have to make that reform based on the criteria that is going to be shared with us by experts in the next few weeks in terms of exceptions. But I think we have always been a protector of the concept of fiscal responsibility. And even though I will finish my administration in August 2022, and many of my political advisors say, well, why are you going to engage in this? I mean, why don't you leave that to the next government? I simply cannot do it. It's pure responsibility with the Colombian people. And as I say, whatever comes out in the fiscal reform, the effects, we're going to see it in 2022 so that we have 2021 to have a rapid recovery. And we want to have a social focalized intervention to protect people to not go back in terms of poverty in 2021. Thank you, General Petraeus.
Thanks, Mr. President, and thanks, General. Next up is Nick Burns.
Mr. President, thank you very much for your remarks. I wanted to follow up with you on Venezuela. I certainly share your view, and I think many Americans in both parties share your view, that Nicolas Maduro's reign has been disastrous for the people of Venezuela, for South America, and for our hemisphere. So 2 questions related. One is, how can the United States best help Colombia to limit the impact of these policies by Maduro in several directions? And particularly, second question, on the refugees. And you're right, this is the greatest refugee crisis in the world. It now exceeds in number of the Syrian refugees. What kind of help do you need from the United States, from refugee organizations, from the United Nations to cope with the influx of refugees in your country?
Thank you so much, Professor Burns. I think we have received a strong support from the United States, and I have to praise and I have to welcome the interest that we had with. I remember Mark Green when he was in USAID. Mark Green was working day by day trying to help us with resources and tackle the effects of the migration crisis. Secretary Pompeo came to Cucuta. He visited us in Cucuta. He saw the situation with his own eyes. And we have also received a bipartisan support. We have received congresswomen and congressmen from different parties from both sides of the aisle, the same with senators. So the political support, I think we have it. The diplomatic support, I think we have it. But let's also be honest. At the end of the day, sometimes we need to have fast resources to attend to specific needs. For example, in terms of health, we have a system in Colombia where you have people under the the payment system, people that have continuous earning of living and they pay for the health system. And we have a subsidized system for the poorest of the poor. But when a migrant comes to an urgency service, you have to provide the service. And what happens is that once they leave, since they are not insured, it becomes a rising debt. And we have faced that situation in many hospitals. What do we need to do? Obviously, be able to pay rapidly those debts. We have done a lot with our own fiscal effort, but we need to do much more, especially in the healthcare attendant program. But let me also be blunt, Professor Burns. Everything that we do at this level is important and relevant for the migrants. That's true. But if we don't do something in the root of the problem, which is the dictatorship, the number of migrants is going to keep on growing day by day. I'm just going to give you an example. Last year, it was at the beginning of 2019, sorry, we had a chickenpox spell in the border zone. Colombia was a country free of chickenpox. We had to do all the epidemiological controls, and we were able to contain the influx of chickenpox. When we made the evaluation why this had happened, obviously those chickenpox cases came from the border zone because Venezuela has not been able to successfully vaccinate their children in years. So that's a health care threat. And also at this moment, since they don't have the capacity, nor the human talent, nor the technology to deal with the pandemic, we have had to close the border and have a lot of epidemiological controls because otherwise it would hit us bad. So I think this is a moment where we all have to realize that business as usual is going to make things worse. I don't know what the approach specifically will be, but I have heard the comments made by Secretary Blinken that I think are very important because his statements have been clear to denounce Maduro as a dictator and that he is going to use all his energies so that there is a change and that there is the possibility to the rebirth of democracy in Venezuela. I see that as a positive thing because I think it's a continuation, obviously with their own criteria and specific decisions, but that continuation is important at this moment. And I think, Professor Burns, the most important thing to be done is to close a multilateral coordination agreement so that the dictatorship comes to an end and there is a call for free elections and hand in hand with an economic and social recovery program for Venezuela.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Burns.
So the next question, I believe, is from Alexandra Graham, who should also be on Zoom. Alexandra Graham.
President, it's been great to hear from you today. You've spoken a lot about economic challenges, including COVID-19 crisis and the refugee crisis. And my question for you is about the political institutions in Colombia. And I'm wondering, what steps will Colombia need to take in the next few years to consolidate their democracy and to move that forward? Is it an economic approach? Is that kind of the approach you need to take, or is it a more political approach?
Alexander, thank you for your question. And what I like about the question is, let's close our eyes for a second and go back 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I remember a foreign policy magazine that was talking about failed states. And that magazine that had a ranking had Colombia in the middle. I mean, we were very close, according to that ranking, to be considered a failed state. When we look 20 years after, and we see that Colombia has become a member of the OECD, that Colombia has been able to expand the income per capita, that we have been able to reduce mortality rates, that we have expanded infrastructure, water and storage, electricity, and even having very important substantial triumphs of security. And as I have said, we closed last year with the lowest homicide rate in 46 years. I think the Colombian institutions have been strengthened. And I think Colombia is really at a much better shape in all the fronts compared to what we had 20 years ago, but also we have seen a very important evolution. And looking at Colombia as a member of the OECD is something that we couldn't even think about 20 years ago. So I think that's important. Now, where the challenges are, because I think your question is also, where is that we have to improve more? I consider that we have to keep on strengthening the local institutions in communities, and especially in places that are pretty much far from the urban areas, so that we improve the quality of government, transparency in government, the flow of investment, and the provision of public goods. Obviously, there's still a lot to be done, but I feel happy that this has been the government that has expanded the most the construction and putting in place more classrooms in Colombia. I feel very proud that we have been able to close substantially the gap in rural areas that were not connected to electricity. I feel very proud that we're going to make the biggest investment ever in tertiary roads, even compared to the last decades, year over year. And when I look even at housing programs, even in the year of the pandemic, 2020, we had the years of the highest amount of sales of houses in Colombia, driven by low-income housing acquisitions, because we have a cross-subsidy method that has allowed people to pay less for their new home than the way we're paying before for rent. All those things are happening, and we have to set state policies so that this keeps on happening at a faster pace, even after our administration. So I see that with optimism, and obviously we need to strengthen the levels of security, defeat the dissidencies and those groups that want to affect communities and affect the lives of social leaders. But I think Colombia has today stronger institutions, has coherent institutions, and even recognizing the separation of powers, I think we have been able to have very good coordination so that the shared objectives as a nation are met by the work of all the institutions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. President. We've got about a little over 5 minutes to come, and quite a lot of people in the queue. So I might summarize a few of the questions that have been coming through. There have been several on an environmental theme, and in particular concern that you expressed about climate change, but specifically about the Amazon. Obviously, some of it is in Colombia, and people are concerned by, shall we put it politely, the more laissez-faire attitude of President Bolsonaro in Brazil. How do you see that issue shaping up?
Well, Gideon, I have always considered myself a true environmentalist, and I think the important thing about our administration regarding climate change is that we speak with results. So let me tell you what the strategy is. On the one hand, energy transition. When our administration began, we had 35 megawatts of installed capacity in non-conventional renewables, primarily wind and solar. We're going to finish this year with more than 1,000 megawatts of installed capacity, and we will be leaving government next year with more than 2,500 megawatts of installed capacity. That's the biggest change in an energy matrix in Latin America in terms of non-conventional renewables. This year, we have been inaugurating solar farms, and by the end of the year, we'll be inaugurating the biggest wind farm in Colombia. And even our national oil company, Ecopetrol, is going to be transformed into an energy company, and something that is very important, Gideon. In just 1 year, Ecopetrol has become the #1 auto consumer with non-conventional renewable energies. So energy transition on the lead. Clean transportation. We launched the electric vehicle bill. Last year, we had an increase in the year of the pandemic. The sales of electric vehicles spiked 70%. And this January, it spiked 70% compared to January 2020. So that's something that's also happening. And today, in terms of public transportation, we have the biggest fleet using electric vehicles in Latin America and the Caribbean. Third element, protecting the Amazon and high altitude ecosystems. Colombia has 6% of the whole Amazon basin, but that 6% represents 35% of our own land. And we have 50% of the Colombian soil in tropical jungle, and we have 52% of the whole páramos in the world. And the páramos and the Amazon are connected through the water cycles. So that's why the Amazon protection, it's a priority to us. That's why we launched the Leticia Pact that was also joined by President Bolsonaro and other presidents from the Amazonic Basin, President of Bolivia, President of Ecuador, President of Peru, President of Guyana, President of Suriname. They were all together working to protect the Amazon, and we have established clear objectives and monitoring results year over year. Something important, we have joined the initiative of the 1 trillion trees that was launched by the World Economic Forum, and we have set a target to plant 180 million trees by the end of our administration. This year, we will close with 125 million trees planted in Colombia. So we're reforesting the country and fighting deforestation, not only with stronger legislation, but also with contracts to pay families to protect those tropical forests. So this strategy is also connected with the circular economy. And I will finish with this. We have set two very important goals for the long and midterm. We are going to Glasgow to the next climate convention, forum, or summit with a clear pledge. We want to reduce by 51% our CO2 emissions by 2030. That's the biggest pledge made by now by a Latin American country. And the second thing we have said as a pledge and as an objective that we want to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. That's where we are setting Colombia. And it has to be something that involves us as individuals. That's why we're working to launch a platform and an app so that we can be able to monitor our individual carbon footprint. So we know that each one of us can contribute, and that the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, that are part of the circular economy are embraced by individuals in Colombia.
Okay, we're almost up at time, but I must now call upon former Ambassador Mike McKinley, who you'll know. Ambassador McKinley.
Mr. President, hello. And it seems to me you're describing a moment of a paradigm shift economically for Colombia, notwithstanding the pandemic, the massive investment in infrastructure, expanding services for people, investing in new technologies, addressing the climate change challenge. Do you see an opportunity at the Summit of the Americas for a reset in the dialogue of the United States with Latin America generally on the new opportunities for economic growth in the region? Focus on progress and optimism, positive messaging, as opposed to just the endemic problems which these summits tend to address. You've outlined a very persuasive case on what Colombia is doing to take the next great leap forward on economic issues.
Ambassador McKinley, it's great to hear from you. And I want to say this publicly. People like you have supported Colombia in very difficult times, and we're also architects of the transformation that I mentioned. And thanks to persons like you, Plan Colombia was implemented, and we always have not only high recognition for your work here in Colombia. You mentioned something interesting. How can we take the best advantage of the Summit of the Americas? Obviously, this is going to be a very important summit. And as I say, Ambassador, there is a great opportunity, and it's because this will be the 60th anniversary of the Alliance for Progress. And the Alliance for Progress was a very broad and ambitious initiative that was launched by President Kennedy to connect with Latin America. Obviously, when we look what we have achieved now vis-a-vis what we had in 1960, today there's something very important, and it's trade. The U.S. has free trade agreements barely with all the countries in Latin America. Now, saying that, the most important thing that I think can be helpful for the United States and helpful for Latin America is how the concept of nearshoring becomes a great opportunity, because it would be a private sector based solution to address the need of creating jobs, to having a quick recovery out of the pandemic in Latin America, and at the same time connecting Latin America with the United States. So the United States has identified in the pandemic that some of the companies that have based their production lines in Asia should also have lines that are close to market for security reasons, for sustainability reasons, and Latin America is there. If we see the strategy of nearshoring as a great opportunity, it will bring investment, it will generate jobs, and it would allow the United States to have products maybe at a better price, or at least with a clearer logistical flexibility, considering the closest to market. I think those issues have to be raised in the summit, because countries like Colombia, we have been preparing for that. We have been calling companies from the United States to set their operational lines in Colombia. They know that we have shared values for a long time, and we simply consider that that is a way to go. But obviously, the summit can also be very important in terms to set goals in the fight against climate change. And I see that this is a great momentum, because you look at a country like Colombia. Colombia only represents 0.4% of all the world CO2 emissions. But we have said we want to reduce our emissions by 51% in 2030. So if a country that just represents 0.4% of all the CO2 emissions is saying that that we want to embrace that challenge, I think it's also a great message to be shared with the United States. And also because getting to that target implies renewable energies, sustainable living, be able to have a circular economy. And with that, I think the US can be able to transfer a lot of technologies. Even though I also consider that the space for the fourth industrial revolution in Latin America is ready to go, because we have invested in telecom technologies to move faster. And I want to see AI, IoT, cloud computing, robotics, and cybersecurity being the driver of new employment in Latin America. And the United States has a lot to do there. And I am happy to see Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, Oracle, all the big ones in technology looking at my country, at Colombia, as the place to come and invest and generate new product lines. But I also want to see that happening in the rest of the region. So definitely, Ambassador, I think this summit, if we get to narrow it to concrete elements and objectives, I think we can set the path for the next decade. And I think it will be great to be inspired by what was achieved with the Alliance for Progress 60 years ago.
Many thanks to Ambassador Mike McKinley for asking that question. And Mr. President, we want to thank you for spending this hour, actually a little bit more than an hour with us. It's been a fascinating look at the many challenges you face. And I can assure you of this, Colombia continues to have bipartisan support among Democrats and Republicans in our country. That's going to be the case because of your importance to us. And I want to thank you for joining our Global Leaders series. I want to thank our good friend, Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times, for his expert interview. Thank you, Mr. President. And good
Thank you, Professor Burns. And thank you, Gideon. It has been a great pleasure. And I look forward to see you in person visiting Colombia. All the best.
That'd be great.
Thank you. We look forward to it. Thanks, Mr. President. Thanks, Gideon. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.